On the 5th of April 1909, a newspaper in Phoenix, Arizona, ran a story on its front page about a cave, not a small cave, a tunnel bored nearly a mile into the rock of the Grand Canyon, lined with chambers, filled with artifacts that had no business being in North America, copper weapons hardened by a lost process, statues seated in the posture of a Buddha, hieroglyphs cut into the walls, mummies wrapped and laid in rows. The paper said the dig was funded by the Smithsonian Institution, led by a man named G.E. Kincaid, supervised by a professor named S.A. Jordan. And then the story stopped. No follow-up, no photographs, no location. The Smithsonian would later say it had never heard of either man. The cave, if it ever existed, sits inside a section of the canyon that ordinary people have not been permitted to walk into since. That is the claim anyway. And whether you believe a word of it, the thing worth asking is not whether there are Egyptian mummies under the Colorado River. I have to pause here for a second. Because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. The thing worth asking is why a stretch of public land gets drawn around, named after foreign gods, and quietly closed. Because that part is not a rumor, that part is on the record. Let me start with the article itself, because most people who repeat this story have never read it. The paper was the Arizona Gazette. It was a real publication. The date is real. You can pull the microfilm. The headline announced explorations in the Grand Canyon and promised that mysteries of an immense, rich cavern were being brought to light. The byline belonged to no one in particular. The body of the piece described how an explorer named Kincaid, traveling the Colorado alone in a wooden boat, had spotted stains on the sheer rock face high above the water. He climbed to them. He found the mouth of a passage cut by hand. Inside, according to the account, the passage ran level and true for hundreds of feet before opening into a central chamber, and from that chamber other passages branched out like the spokes of a wheel. In the side rooms were the artifacts: urns, copper implements, grey metal that rang like a bell, a crypt containing the mummies, and at the head of the great hall an idol seated cross-legged, holding a lotus flower, carved in the manner of the East. The account did not stop at the idol. It described a shrine directly behind the seated figure, and in the shrine a broken idol, as if the place had been abandoned in the middle of some ceremony. It described hieroglyphs cut over the doorway of every chamber, characters the writer compared to the writing of ancient Egypt. It described seeds of grain and pottery, and a yellow-grey metal that no one could identify. It described a room the writer would not fully describe at all, a crypt, where the mummies were tiered on shelves, the largest of them standing well over the height of a man. It even gave the artifacts a nationality, insisting that the whole assemblage pointed east across the Pacific toward Tibet or Egypt or some vanished middle ground between them, a race that had come to America long before any date the textbooks allowed. The detail was the genius of the piece. A liar keeps it vague. This writer buried the reader in particulars, and particulars feel like evidence even when they are only ink. It is a wonderful piece of writing. It is also almost certainly not true, and I want to be honest about that from the beginning, because the interesting part survives the debunking. The Gazette printed sensational material regularly. Frontier papers competed for readers with tall tales, and a lost civilization under the most famous hole in America was exactly the kind of thing that sold copies. There is no independent record of an explorer named G.E. Kincaid working for the Smithsonian in that period. When researchers wrote to the institution decades later, the reply was consistent: no Kincaid, no Jordan, no expedition, no cave. The Smithsonian has spent a century saying, in effect, that it does not know what anyone is talking about. So, on the surface, this is a closed case. A small newspaper printed a hoax, the institution denied it, and the story should have died. It did not die. It has outlived every editor who worked at that paper, and the reason it refuses to die is not the mummies. It is a coincidence of geography that the hoax writer probably did not fully understand when he sat down to invent it. He set his fake Egyptian tomb in a part of the canyon that was, at that very moment, being filled with real Egyptian names by the United States government. Look at a topographic map of the Grand Canyon. Really look at it. The great rock formations that rise from the canyon floor, the buttes, and the isolated peaks that stand like cathedrals inside the gorge are not named after presidents or generals or the men who surveyed them. They are named Isis Temple, Osiris Temple, Horus Temple, the Tower of Ra, the Tower of Set, Cheops Pyramid. Beyond the Egyptian cluster you find Buddha Temple and Buddha Cloister, Shiva Temple, Vishnu Temple, Brahma Temple, Zoroaster Temple, Confucius Temple, Manu Temple, Deva Temple. An entire pantheon of the Old World, the whole religious imagination of Egypt and India and Persia and China, mapped onto the stone of the American Southwest. And the man who did most of the naming was not a mystic. He was a geologist working for the Federal Survey. His name was Clarence Dutton. In 1882 he published a government monograph called The Tertiary History of the Grand Canyon District, and it remains one of the most beautifully written scientific documents this country ever produced. Dutton looked at the enormous isolated masses of rock inside the canyon and decided that ordinary naming was inadequate to them. They were too vast, too temple-like, too solemn, so he reached for the architecture of the ancient world. He called one great formation the Vishnu Temple because it reminded him of an oriental pagoda. He seeded the whole district with the names of Eastern gods, and the surveyors who came after him extended the scheme, adding Isis and Osiris and Ra until the canyon read like a lost scripture. Dutton did not invent this habit alone. He inherited a whole romantic tradition of naming that treated the American landscape as a gallery of the sublime, and he had a collaborator in the artists and mapmakers who worked the same country. The painter, Thomas Moran, whose canvases of the canyon helped persuade Congress there was something here worth protecting, saw the formations the same way Dutton did, as architecture rather than geology, and one of the great buttes carries Moran's name to this day. The survey was not a neutral tape measure dragged across the ground. It was a machine for producing meaning, and the meaning it produced was grand, foreign, and vaguely sacred. When the later surveyors filled in the gaps on Dutton's map, they kept faith with his scheme, reaching again and again for the temples and the towers and the gods until the interior of the canyon read less like a geological province and more like the ruin of a religion. This was a deliberate act of branding by an arm of the state. The United States Geological Survey did not simply measure this land. It authored the imaginative frame through which the land would forever be seen. A name on an official map is not a suggestion. It is the version of reality the government will print, teach, and defend, and every other name is thereby made unofficial, folklore, error. The people who had lived in and around the canyon for thousands of years had their own names for these places, names tied to origin stories and to the practical business of survival, and those names were quietly written over by a pantheon borrowed from empires that had never touched the continent. That is what branding does. It replaces the meaning that grew from the ground with a meaning issued from a desk. And when you brand a hole in the ground with the names of dead empires, you should not be surprised when people start believing dead empires are buried in it. Here is where the money enters, because it always enters, and in this niche it is the only part that ever really matters. Naming is not decoration, naming is a claim. When the survey fixed those names to those rocks, it was doing the same thing a company does when it registers a trademark. It was establishing that the meaning of this place would be issued from a central authority, and that the authority would be the federal government and the scientific institutions that served it. The Smithsonian sat at the top of that structure. From its founding, its Bureau of Ethnology had taken as its mission the definitive account of who the original Americans were and what they had built. That account was, in a real sense, a monopoly product. There was going to be one official story of American prehistory, and it was going to be manufactured, quality-controlled, and distributed from a single building in Washington. To understand how that monopoly behaved, you have to look at what it had already done, 20 years before the Kincaid story ran. Across the eastern half of the continent stood tens of thousands of earthen mounds. Some were burial mounds. Some were enormous flat-topped platforms larger at the base than the Great Pyramid. For most of the 19th century, educated white Americans refused to believe that the ancestors of living native people had built them. They invented a vanished superior race, a lost civilization of mound builders, who had raised these works and then been exterminated by the savage Indians who currently occupied the land. This was not an innocent error. It was an extraordinarily convenient one. If a superior lost race had built the mounds and been wiped out by the current inhabitants, then the current inhabitants were themselves conquerors with no deeper claim to the ground, and removing them was not theft. It was closer to justice. The myth of the lost race was a subsidy paid to the removal of living people from valuable land. And it was the Smithsonian that eventually dismantled that myth. In 1894, its investigator Cyrus Thomas published an exhaustive report demonstrating that the mounds were built by the ancestors of the native nations who lived among them. The institution got the science right, but notice the shape of the thing. The central authority manufactured the correction to a myth that the central authority and its predecessors had helped sustain, and in doing so it confirmed once again that the past of this continent was theirs to define, to open and to close. Whatever the true story of any given ruin, the right to tell it belonged to Washington. That is the pattern the Kincaid hoax stumbled into. A story about the Smithsonian secretly controlling a cave of forbidden artifacts is a fantasy. A reality in which the Smithsonian controlled the entire official narrative of American antiquity is not a fantasy, it is simply the history of American archaeology. Now walk the timeline of the land itself, because the closing that gives this story its title is real, even if the cave is not. John Wesley Powell ran the Colorado through the Grand Canyon in 1869 and again in 1871, the one armed veteran leading wooden boats through water that had killed men before and would kill men after. Powell became the second director of the Geological Survey and the founding head of that Bureau of Ethnology. The men who mapped the canyon and the men who defined its prehistory answered, in the end, to the same small circle. Powell is the hinge of this whole story, so it is worth being precise about what he built. He did not only run the river and draw the maps. He constructed the institutional apparatus that would decide for the entire country what a native person was, what a native language was, and what a native ruin meant. His bureau produced the classifications, the vocabularies, the reports, the great multi-volume handbook that catalogued the tribes as if they were species. This was scholarship, and much of it was careful, and some of it preserved knowledge that would otherwise have been lost. But it was also power of a particular kind. It set the terms. A living people whose account of their own past differed from the Bureau's account did not have a competing theory. They had a superstition, to be corrected by the science coming out of Washington. The right to be believed had been centralized along with everything else. The survey named the temples, the Bureau owned the past, and then the government began to fence the ground. In 1906, Theodore Roosevelt signed the Antiquities Act. On its face, it was a conservation law written to stop the looting of ruins in the Southwest, and looting was a genuine problem. But read what the act actually granted. It gave the president the power, by his signature alone, without a vote in Congress, to withdraw any quantity of federal land from ordinary use and place it under permanent protection as a national monument. It also made it a federal crime for any unauthorized person to excavate or remove antiquities from federal land. In a single stroke, the digging up of the American past was nationalized. From 1906 forward, you could not lawfully open the ground and take what you found. The ground, and everything the ground contained, belonged to the state, and access to it was a permit to be granted or withheld. Roosevelt used that new power on the Grand Canyon almost immediately. He had already created the Grand Canyon Game Preserve. In 1908, he proclaimed the Grand Canyon National Monument, drawing the federal line around more than 800,000 acres. In 1919, Congress converted it into a national park. Across those 13 years, a landscape that had been open range, mining district, and native homeland became a managed federal property with gates, fees, permits, and boundaries. And 1909, the year of the Kincaid story, sits precisely in the middle of that enclosure. The hoax was printed in the exact window when the canyon was being drawn around and closed off, in fact. Think about the timing as a reader in Phoenix would have lived it. The game preserve was fresh. The monument was 1 year old. The talk of a full national park was already in the air. The ground itself was visibly changing hands. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. From open country to guarded property, in the same seasons the article ran. The writer set his forbidden cave inside a place that was, in the most literal legal sense, becoming forbidden ground. He may have been inventing a mystery. He was also, without meaning to, describing a policy. This is the honest reading, and I think it is the more unsettling one, because it does not require a single mummy. You do not need a secret Egyptian tomb to explain why parts of the Grand Canyon are effectively off-limits to civilians. The National Park Service restricts access to enormous areas of the backcountry, and the formations named for the eastern gods are among the least visited places in the entire park. Isis Temple in particular is a genuinely difficult objective, a butte marooned in the middle of the canyon, requiring a permit, hard route finding, and real risk to reach. Very few people have ever stood on top of it. Not because the government is hiding a crypt up there, but because reaching it is punishing and the permit system is designed to keep the fragile interior of the canyon nearly empty. The closure is real. The reason the closure is given is conservation and safety. The mystery lives in the gap between how total the closure is and how thin the official explanation can feel when you are standing at the boundary of it. But hold the conservation explanation up to the light for a moment, because in this niche we do not take the given reason at face value. We ask who profits from the arrangement, and there the picture sharpens. The Grand Canyon did not become a protected wilderness in an economic vacuum. It became protected at the exact moment it became a product. The Santa Fe Railway reached the South Rim in 1901. The Fred Harvey Company built the Grand El Tovar Hotel on the edge in 1905. What was being sold was the view, the pristine and empty and sublime spectacle, the sense that you had come to the edge of something older and larger than yourself. An empty canyon full of temples named for vanished empires is worth a great deal to a railroad and a hotel chain. A canyon crawling with prospectors, squatters, and pot hunters is worth much less. Federal protection did not only preserve the rock, it preserved the value of the rock as an experience, and it transferred control of that experience from the scattered people who had been using the land to the concessioners and agencies who would now meter it out one train ticket at a time. The mechanics of that transfer are worth spelling out, because they are the actual engine under the romance. A national park is not simply a protected space. It is a monopoly concession, and the concession is enormously valuable precisely because the state has forbidden competitors from operating inside the boundary. The Fred Harvey Company did not merely build a hotel at the Grand Canyon. It held the exclusive right to sell the canyon to the visitors the railroad delivered, and it built an entire aesthetic to justify the price. The architect, Mary Coulter, designed buildings at the rim meant to look ancient, as if they had grown out of the ground alongside the ruins, so that a tourist stepping off a train could feel he had arrived somewhere timeless and consecrated rather than at a commercial platform run for profit. The empty sublime canyon, the one wrapped in the names of the gods, was the flagship product, and everything about the federal enclosure protected its value. Keep the interior empty and the view stays priceless. Let the prospectors and squatters back in, and the magic, along with the margin, is gone. Conservation and commerce were not in tension here. They were the same policy seen from two angles. Consider who was standing on the land when the fence went up. The Havasupai people had lived and farmed in and around the canyon for centuries, moving between the plateau and the side canyons with the seasons. The creation of the game preserve, the monument, and the park steadily squeezed them off ground they had always used, confining them to a fraction of their homeland and restricting the movements that had sustained them. Their farms in the side canyons, their winter camps on the plateau, their trails between the two, all of it fell inside lines drawn by men who had never asked them and who regarded their presence as a management problem to be solved. They were pushed into a narrow reservation and told that the wider country they had always moved through now belonged to the nation, to be entered on the nation's terms. It took until 1975, after decades of fighting, for Congress to return a substantial portion of that land to the tribe, and even that restoration was partial and hard-won. So when the story says no civilian has crossed a certain line since 1909, strip away the Egyptian mummies and a harder truth is sitting underneath it. There were people crossing those lines freely for a very long time, and the closing of the canyon is, among other things, the story of how they were stopped. The Forbidden Zone is not guarding a cave of artifacts. The Forbidden Zone is the shape left behind when a homeland is converted into a federal asset. The legal machinery only tightened after 1909. In 1979, Congress passed the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, which sharpened the Antiquities Act into a modern enforcement regime with serious criminal penalties for anyone who digs, collects, or traffics in artifacts from federal or tribal land without a permit. In 1990, the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act layered on another set of controls governing human remains and sacred objects. The cumulative effect is that today, on the public lands of the United States, the past is one of the most heavily regulated substances there is. And it is not only the buried past that is metered. The right to reach the hard interior of the canyon, to descend below the rim and stay the night, is itself rationed through a permit lottery that turns away far more people than it admits. The right to film there commercially, to point a professional camera at the same view a tourist may photograph for free, requires its own federal permit and its own fee. The right to conduct research, to so much as measure or sample the ground with scientific intent, runs through an approval process controlled by the agency. Layer these together, and you find that nearly every serious form of access to the place has a gate and a gatekeeper. You may hike across it, you may photograph it, you may not open it. If you find a work stone or a fragment of pottery and you carry it home, you have committed a federal crime. The ground beneath the Grand Canyon is, in the fullest sense the phrase allows, closed. And it was closed not by a conspiracy in 1909, but by a century of law, each layer of which had a reasonable justification, and each of which also happened to concentrate authority over the American past in the same institutional hands that had held it since Powell. It is worth pausing on how this story came back to life, because the revival is itself a small lesson in economics. For most of the 20th century, the Kincaid article slept in a microfilm reel, a forgotten curiosity. Then, in the last decades of the century and into the Internet age, it was rediscovered, reprinted, and folded into a growing marketplace of alternative history. Writers in that world built careers on exactly this kind of material, the suppressed discovery, the artifact that does not fit, the institution that will not talk. The story was perfect for the trade. It came with a real newspaper, a real date, a famous location, and a powerful institution issuing a denial that could be sold as a cover-up. It cost nothing to reproduce, and it generated books, lectures, television segments, and eventually an endless supply of videos. The Smithsonian's refusal to engage, which is what any institution does with a hoax, became the product's most valuable feature, because a silence can be narrated as a secret. The cave never had to be found. Not finding it was better business than finding it, since a solved mystery stops selling and an open one sells forever. The 1909 hoax and its modern resellers are separated by 100 years and joined by the same insight that an unanswered question about the buried past is a renewable resource. Now let me give the skeptics their full due, because the version of this story that circulates online is a mess, and it deserves to be taken apart honestly. The Kincaid Cave has never been located because it does not exist. The passages described in the article, the level tunnel running a mile into the rock, the wheel of side chambers, the crypt of mummies, correspond to no known geology or archaeology in the canyon. No photograph was ever produced. No artifact was ever catalogued. The Smithsonian did not lose the records. There were no records. The Egyptian and Hindu place names were not evidence of ancient occupation. They were applied by a Victorian geologist reaching for grand imagery, decades before the hoax, and their existence is what made the hoax plausible rather than what the hoax revealed. Even the modern revival of the story rests on a misreading. When people quote the Smithsonian denial as proof of a cover-up, they are treating an ordinary institutional shrug as a confession, which is exactly the logical trap that keeps conspiracy stories alive. Absence of a record is being read as suppression of a record. It usually is not. And the restricted access, the real closure that gives the tale its spine, has a real and sufficient explanation. The interior of the Grand Canyon is one of the most fragile and dangerous landscapes in North America. People die there every year from heat, from falls, from the river. The permit system exists because unlimited access would destroy the thing everyone comes to see and would kill far more visitors than it already does. The formations named for the gods are empty not because they are guarded, but because they are nearly unreachable. You do not need a secret to explain why almost no one has stood on Isis temple. You need only to try to walk there. So the honest verdict is clear. There is no Egyptian tomb under the Colorado. There is no line patrolled to keep civilians away from mummies. The 1909 article was a hoax, and a good one, and it should be enjoyed as a hoax. But the reason it has lasted for over a century is that it accidentally told a true story in the costume of a false one. It said that there is a part of this canyon you are not allowed to enter, that a central authority controls what may be found there and who may look, and that the whole place is wrapped in the names of vanished empires. Every one of those things is true. The authority is the federal government and the institutions of official science. The control is the accumulated weight of the Antiquities Act, the park boundary, the permit office, and 2 further federal statutes on top of them. The vanished empires are painted onto the maps in ink that dried in 1882. The hoax got the mummies wrong and the structure exactly right. Strip out the copper weapons and the seated idol and the crypt of giants, and what remains is a plain description of an enclosure. A place you cannot enter, a gate you did not build, a keeper who will not fully explain, names on the map that come from somewhere else. The writer dressed all of that in Egyptian costume because a costume sells, but underneath the costume he was pointing at the real thing, and the real thing is still there. There is a lesson in why the false version travels so much faster than the true one. The story of an Egyptian tomb sealed by a shadowy institution is thrilling, and it flatters the person who repeats it because it lets him feel he has seen through a lie that the experts want hidden. The true story asks more of him. It asks him to sit with the fact that the closing of the canyon was done in the open, by ordinary laws, with reasonable justifications, over a span of years, and that its consequences fell hardest not on treasure hunters but on the people who had lived there first. There is no secret to expose, only a process to notice, and a process is harder to be angry at than a villain. So the hoax spreads, and the history sits still. That gap between the mystery people crave and the mechanism actually at work is the same gap this whole niche was built to stand inside. Because here is what the whole niche keeps circling. The most valuable thing a state or an institution can own is not the gold in the ground or the timber on the surface. It is the authority to tell you what the ground means, what was here before you, and whether you are permitted to go and see for yourself. Whoever holds that authority holds something worth more than any single artifact, because they hold the frame around all of them. The Grand Canyon was named by the survey, its past was owned by the Bureau, its acreage was withdrawn by proclamation, and its interior was sealed by permit. The cave of copper and mummies never existed. The enclosure it was invented to hide is standing in plain sight, drawn on every map, printed in every statute, and enforced at every trailhead. A man in 1909 made up a tunnel full of gods to explain why you cannot go in there. The real reason you cannot go in there is far less romantic and far more revealing. Somebody decided, a long time ago, that the past was a thing that could be owned, and then they went about owning it. The line in the canyon is real. It was simply never quite the line the story said it was. Make of that what you will.